First of all, it's nice to be here again at the Oshman family JCC. I was here almost 2 years ago, and it's always fun to see familiar faces. I'm going to talk about 4 developments. Not all of them were entirely surprising, but I think they dominated the news throughout the year. And regarding most of them, we don't see yet where it's heading. The first, and I believe the most important regionally and globally, is the fact that what I call the Las Vegas principle is no longer valid in the Middle East. If in the past almost 5 years, since the Arab Spring revolutions, the wars in the region more or less stayed in the region, this is no longer the case. The rise of ISIS, of the Islamic State, into a kind of rogue state occupying large parts of Syria and Iraq, with no military power in the region or outside it, willing to take it on, to fight it seriously, to destroy it. The fact that the wave of refugees flowing from Syria and its neighborhood into Europe is threatening the basis of freedom of movement in the European Union. To the extent that it never happened before. The fact that Russia invaded Syria, invited by the Assad government to save it from destruction. But now the most significant military power across the Israeli border is Russia, is Vladimir Putin and his Air Force. And clearly we don't know, we have no idea to what extent the Russians will commit their military power into Syria. Are they going, because now it's just air power, are they going to deploy ground forces? Are they going to rely on the Iranian ground forces and Hezbollah to fight the rebels? Is Assad going to survive? Is it going to be a different Syrian regime under some clone of Assad, even if he retires or ousted? We have no idea. We have no idea whether Syria will ever become, and Iraq will ever become unified states again. And clearly this dominates the strategic horizon of Israel, even though in the past 5 years, Israel has mostly stayed away from the war in Syria. And the outbursts of occasional mortar or rocket fire into Israel, or occasional Israeli Air Force bombings of armed convoys and storage places within Syria with Iranian and Russian weapon systems aimed to reach Hezbollah, which Israel doesn't take credit for. These are still not full involvement and engagement in the Syrian civil war. But in the past few weeks, it burst out of Syria. First, the downing of the Russian passenger plane over the Sinai, one of the worst terrorist attacks in history, which happened around the corner, across the border, and reminded us that we have ISIS not only in Syria, but also in the Sinai, across the Egyptian border. Then came a suicide bombing in Beirut, at the stronghold of Hezbollah, which maybe not many people in Israel felt sorry about. But it once again showed that ISIS is serious about taking the war to their adversaries' territory. And last but pretty much not least, the attacks in Paris, which again, although preceded by the Charlie Hebdo and the Hyper Cacher attacks in January, once again shaking the foundations of the European Union, shaking the foundations of the French Republic, of their integration of minorities. And once again, with no end in sight, where is it going to head? How is it going to affect the political regimes within Europe, the rise of right-wing governments? What are they going to do? This is different than the 9/11 attacks in the United States, because in this case, most of the perpetrators came from France, from Belgium. They did not fly from the Middle East to commit suicide attacks in Europe. They're part and parcel of the European culture. And obviously, it's far more difficult to deal with. Now, this does not involve Israel specifically, or at least not yet. Then we had a second important development, which was more expected, less surprising, was the nuclear deal with Iran, and which Prime Minister Netanyahu was trying desperately to prevent through his speech at the US Congress and through a large, major effort, major diplomatic effort, which on one hand failed. The agreement was reached. Iran is not yet, it's not exactly the end of the conflict between the US and Iran. We heard the same down with America and anti-Israeli statements coming from Tehran after the agreement as before. But still, the rise of ISIS is bringing Iran and the United States and the West and Russia closer together because they see a common enemy, and Israel smartly doesn't stand in the way, because in the twisted upside down world of the Middle East, the frenemy situation is such that Iran and Hezbollah are actually the gravest enemies of Israel, are also Israel's buffer zone between Israel and ISIS. They are fighting ISIS, and they don't have any energy, Hezbollah, they don't have any energy or motivation to spare against us, but they're also keeping ISIS away from the Israeli border. But the Iran deal raised a lot of debate within the American Jewish community, less so in Israel. In Israel, although the Netanyahu speech in Congress happened 2 weeks before the election, there was very little debate because the major opposition parties from the outset said that on Iran there is no opposition coalition in Israel and they support Netanyahu. So there was not much debate about it. There was some criticism of Netanyahu's ruining the relationship with the United States. That didn't happen. We just saw him in Washington a couple of weeks ago, not speaking about Iran any longer. In other words, he accepted the deal as a fait accompli. In return, he got more military assistance and a public pledge from President Obama not to engage in the peace process until the end of his term, which for Netanyahu is good news. He didn't like the Kerry mission, and he didn't like its resumption, and now the nuisance of another round of anxious American diplomats running around the region and trying to bridge between him and the Palestinian president, Abu Mazen, is off the table. Now, we must remember one thing about the Iran deal. It was right by the mold and the old formula of American-Israeli relations, in which the closer it is to home, from our perspective, Israel has more to say. The farther it is from Israel, America has the final word. For example, when Israel tried to sell arms to China against American wishes, America put an end to it, put on hold security cooperation with Israel until Israel got the message, and stopped selling arms to China. And nobody in America, not in Congress, not even the best friends of Israel on Capitol Hill, or in the Jewish community, were willing to listen to Israeli pleas to keep on selling arms to China. Why? Because the American government said, and these were the friendliest relations between a president and a prime minister, both Barack and Clinton and Bush and Sharon. In both cases, the Americans said stop, and Israel stopped. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the Palestinian issue, on which, since 1948, the final word was mostly Israel's. And America, most of the time, followed the Israeli cue. When Arafat was the ally and interlocutor and negotiating partner of Israel, he was also a very welcome visitor to the White House. When that ended, he was no longer invited to Washington. And there are many other examples. But since this is crucial to Israel's national security, on this, America gets the cue from Israel, even when there are disagreements. They don't change the basic. For example, over the settlements, decades of American administrations called them obstacle to peace, illegal, illegitimate, any name you want, and Israel kept building the settlements despite that. Or in other words, the final word was Israel's, not America's. And then you have a vast area in between, which I can call the wider Middle East, Syria, Iran, the Gulf, Egypt, on which American administrations were willing to listen to Israeli concerns, but in the end of the day, the final word was American and not Israeli. And the Iran deal falls squarely into this mold. And it could be expected despite the Herculean effort by Netanyahu in Congress. And then things got back more or less to business as usual. No big friendship between the president and the prime minister, but they found their way of working together on the security package and other issues, as we saw during the Netanyahu visit 3 weeks ago. The third development was local, and that was the March election in Israel, which was a very early election. The previous government served barely 2 years until the prime minister dissolved the coalition and called an early election. Throughout most of the campaign, he was on the losing side. He lagged behind in the polls. His opponent, Herzog, was leading. And only in the last week, Netanyahu turned the tide through very clever moves on his part. First of all, he portrayed it as a fight against right and left. But in the end, he went after the voters of the smaller parties in the right wing, Habayit HaYehudi and Lieberman's party, and he was able to move many of their voters to vote Likud. And then in the last 48 hours, he did two more things. He pledged that no Palestinian state would come about under his watch. And then on election day, he put out his notorious video in which he said that the Arabs are coming in droves to the polling stations, and therefore the rule of the right wing is in jeopardy. Come to the polling stations and vote for us. Now, he argued that left-wing NGOs were busing the Arab voters, which was not exactly true, but it didn't matter. He won the election. And not only that, after the election, he put together a right-wing coalition, something that he didn't do. In the previous 2 terms, he had partners from the center-left, Ehud Barak and then Tzipi Livni. This time, it was only right-wing parties. And clearly, it's a smaller coalition of 61, but very coherent ideologically, with the Habayit HaYehudi, with the far-right party, giving it the ideological tone. And we saw that the right wing is far more explicit than before. For example, over the issue of Temple Mount, that used to be in the fringe of the right wing. Today, it's mainstream in the Jewish Home Party. It's a mainstream demand for Jewish prayer, and eventually, and more people and rabbis are willing to support the reconstruction of the Third Temple as a kind of a long-term goal of the Jewish state, which was unspoken 2, 3, 5, 10, 15 years ago. And it was one of the major flashpoints vis-a-vis the Palestinians. But I'll get to that in a second. But there were 2 other winners in the election. And these were the representatives of the ultra-Orthodox and Arab minorities in Israel. The Israeli society is changing through the maternity wards. Today, in 1st, 2nd grade in Israeli schools, a little over half the kids come from ultra-Orthodox or Arabic-speaking families. And you have to remember, with talking here about Zionism, these groups, these minorities are not Zionist. They don't serve in the military. They're underemployed. They're not part of the mainstream. And the election marked their rising political power because the Arabs, under pressure, the Arab community joined forces in a joint list, which is now the 3rd largest party in the Knesset. And when you look into any talk show on Israeli television or listen to it on the radio, you hear many more voices with Arabic accent than 10, 15, 20 years ago. But not only that, their narrative, their willingness to put forward a counter-Zionist narrative and a demand for a more egalitarian, less Jewish state, more state for all its citizens, has enormous political implications. Because if the left wants to get back to power, it cannot ignore the 13 members of the joint list. And to them, the price for supporting any coalition is making the country less Jewish and more democratic. No party, no Jewish party today in Israel is willing to go that way. And that means that as long as that's the case, the right wing is almost ensured to be in power for a very long time. And if a center-left party wins the election, as happened under Barak and Olmert, it must include right-wing parties in the coalition if it doesn't want to include the Arab party. And that means that these small right-wing parties would have veto power over any peace deal. And we must remember that. So the Arab party, despite being very deeply in opposition, has enormous power. The other group, the ultra-Orthodox parties, they have fewer seats in the Knesset, but they were able to throw away the previous government's decisions to cut down on their subsidies, on their funding, to try and draft more of their youngsters into military service. All of this went out the window. They got back the subsidies. The new draft law that will be voted on Wednesday is going to turn back the tide of the previous government's reform. They're not going anywhere, and clearly with their growing numbers, ultra-Orthodox schools in Israel are growing at a rate of 4% annually, while secular schools are not growing at all. Do the math. They're not going to be weaker, but stronger. And the only politician in Israel, by the way, who is willing even to raise that issue is President Rivlin, who is worried about the fracturing of Israeli society into tribes and is desperately seeking a kind of more common, more encompassing, more inclusive national ethos. If you have ideas, maybe it's Zionism 4.0, but it's not there yet. And clearly the election, to many of us who anticipated that Netanyahu would lose, he won again, and with a vengeance, and I think he's stronger than ever. There's still no opponent that anybody in Israel can see that threatens Netanyahu's rule, that could challenge him either within or outside his party in the foreseeable future. So far, Netanyahu is the sole arbiter and decision maker over Israel's foreign policy, and to a large extent over its domestic policy as well. Even if at some point down the road, he would change his coalition. And then came the last and most unwelcome surprise of the last year, and that is the new wave of violence, which only today cost the lives of a young woman in Gush Etzion. On Thursday, 5 people, 4 Israelis and a Palestinian, were killed in 2 separate attacks, one in Tel Aviv and one in a settlement. And it's a new reality. Now, we had it before. It's not the first time. It's not, or not yet, the second intifada with the suicide bombings, or the first intifada with mass demonstrations and basically separating the West Bank and Gaza from Israel. But it's something that most people are worried about. The end is not seen in sight. We see a new generation of younger Palestinians, people in their teens, who are risking their lives in order to kill Jews. And the government's response so far was mostly verbal. Military, which is a good thing. Military deployment in the West Bank is not overwhelming. They're trying to take it slow because they don't want to use that deployment as a pretext for more resistance and more violence and more terror attacks and so on, as it happened during the second intifada. And the other suggestions by the government, outlawing the Islamic movement, the northern Islamic movement in Israel, or trying to reduce the age of criminal responsibility to 12, and lock up 12-year-old kids when they're 14 in prison. I don't think this is going to change or resume house demolitions. This is not going to change the dynamic. And since the security cooperation between Israel and the PA is still there at some level, it's very difficult to point a finger at the Palestinian Authority as happened during the Second Intifada. So we have an ongoing crisis with no end in sight, with no political outlet in the form of any meaningful discussions or negotiations, beyond some unspecified pledges by Netanyahu for unilateral steps, which he had to take back, which he made in Washington, and then he had to take back under the pressure of Bennett, of the Jewish Home. But clearly, this is, to us in the news business, this has dominated the news in the past 2-3 months. And my guess is that, high and low, it's going to remain like that in the foreseeable future. We can't identify any mechanism or any solution or any idea that might end it as it began. And this is the new reality of Israel as we approach 2016. To sum up, rising waves of war across the border in Syria that flow from the Middle East all the way to Europe and threaten to change the balance of power within Europe, the treatment of minorities within Europe, and eventually might spill over into Israel from the Sinai, from the Golan Heights. It's not in our hands. Second, resumed cooperation between the Israeli government and the Obama administration after a year or so of impasse and quarrel over the Iran deal, Israel accepting it as a fait accompli in return for security and diplomatic support. Third, a new right-wing government in Israel with the same prime minister, but with a somewhat different agenda. And last but really much not least, a new fresh wave of violence that is worrying Israelis and with no obvious way to end it beyond tactical moves that might mitigate it and absorb some of it, but so far failed to change the basic dynamic of violence. Thank you.
So I have the first question that's come up through the app, and I'd just like to remind you the app is called Evenium Connects, and there's an even simpler password than the one I mentioned earlier, which is ZV3. Okay, that should also get you in there, and you can send additional questions.
This is Silicon Valley. They invented these things.
I know. So I still have to read it out though. So the first question from Melanie Malinas, she asks, what is radicalizing European nationals like the attackers from Belgium and France who committed the attacks in Paris last week? Why are they migrating to ISIS?
Well, I guess it's a better question for my friend Jeffrey Goldberg, who's going to speak after me, who wrote a story about Europe and spent some time there. But I think the most basic thing is that when people feel that over their heads, they look up and they don't see a glass ceiling, but a concrete ceiling, and they feel that they have no opportunity where they live, then they become more and more radical. And there's no outlet for that. But there's a debate in Europe. Some people argue that too much integration brought that about, and the other argument is that too little integration brought that about. But clearly, ISIS is giving them meaning, is giving them hope, it's giving them pride. And what we see as a cruel terrorist group beheading people with no moral values whatsoever in the way they behave towards people under their control in Iraq and Syria, to these people, it gives meaning in life.
Thank you. We have a question now from Peter Frank. will the Russian presence in the region stop Israel from preventing arms transfers to Hezbollah?
The short answer is no, at least in the area around the Israeli border. We just read reports several days ago about 2 Israeli attacks on arms storage places and so on near the Damascus airport. I believe that if Israel would like to attack in northern Syria, which happened a couple of times, or when Israel destroyed the nuclear reactor there, it would have to coordinate with the Russians who control the airspace there. But so far, the Russians have made no effort to tell Israel, leave Hezbollah alone.
Okay, our next question is from Hannah Gold, who says, can you tell us a bit more about the Sinai, which is so very close to Israel and seems such a hotbed of extremism?
Well, it is a kind of, it began in the final years of the Mubarak regime in Egypt. The ability of Cairo to control what was going on in the Sinai deteriorated. And Sinai became safe haven for traffickers of women, of people from Africa who made their way into Israel, of arms making their way into Gaza, and of each and any other form of lawlessness you can think of. And then over time, and especially more so after General Assisi took over power in Cairo, we see more security deployment of the Egyptian forces in the Sinai in agreement with Israel. The level of forces that was envisaged in the peace treaty in 1979 has long been surpassed, but it's not enough. And today, these radicals in the Sinai, and now Israel built a fence along the Egyptian border, which was concluded 2 or 3 years ago, stopped the wave of people, asylum seekers, refugees from Eritrea and Sudan that came into Israel. The Sisi government proved much more effective in preventing arms smuggling into Gaza. But so far, they failed to destroy the terrorist cells in the Sinai, who now identify themselves as a kind of affiliate of ISIS. ISIS works through mergers and acquisitions. They have like affiliates all over the Middle East who call themselves subsidiaries of ISIS. And obviously, the downing of the Russian passenger plane is the most horrible and most violent attack. In some occasions, these guys attacked Israel as well. But so far, we don't see major terrorist wave from the Sinai aimed at Israel. But clearly, the Egyptian border that used to be pretty much open for decades is another flashpoint to worry about. At the same time, security cooperation between Egypt and Israel has peaked like never before.
Okay, one last question. Not an easy one.
Wow.
Got to do some prediction. In a two-state solution, asks Nate Sal, I imagine there would be arms and military restrictions on the Palestinian state. Would Israel be responsible for keeping ISIS moving into a Palestinian state?
For preventing or for facilitating moving ISIS into the Palestinian state? I don't understand.
Would Israel be responsible from ISIS being active inside a future Palestinian state?
Clearly, one of the Israeli demands throughout the peace negotiations, from Oslo all the way through Camp David and beyond, and Annapolis, and the Kerry talks, was to keep some sort of responsibility and control over the external borders of a future Palestinian state, over its airspace, electromagnetic spectrum, etc. Clearly, if Israel controls the external border, and if someone crosses that border, then it's going to be Israel's responsibility. I don't see Israel facilitating this, but You know, a friend of mine once, only half jokingly, said that the Palestinian Authority has the strongest military force in the world. And when I was like, what are you talking about? He said, sure, the IDF. And it's not a joke. The IDF, to a large extent, is keeping the Palestinian Authority alive and well. And clearly, if Israel controls the external border, which the Palestinians oppose, to them, control of the external border is just the same occupation, only with a wider perimeter. And they said, I heard President Abbas saying, he told us when we came to see him last summer in Ramallah, that they're willing to have an international force. At some point, they even said that they don't mind Jewish soldiers of NATO or the American army or whatever name you call it, but not the IDF. But this question shows that with authority comes also responsibility. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the program.